The morning sun bore down on Fort Horizon with the kind of heat that made every salute look sharper, every shadow cut deeper. The parade field shimmered like a sheet of brass, a mirror for the pride and precision assembled upon it. Rows of soldiers stood in perfect formation, dress blues gleaming, medals aligned like constellations across their chests. Behind them, a new monument waited under a draped flag, its granite face etched with the words "Times to the Guardians of the Sky*." The crowd filled the bleachers, families in their Sunday best, local officials, retirees who still carried the quiet dignity of service. The air hummed with the murmur of conversation, the rustle of programs, and the faint smell of jet fuel drifting from the nearby runway. It was the kind of day the military loved. Ceremonial, choreographed, immaculate. Every detail accounted for, every movement rehearsed. Except for one. In the third row of the reserved seating area, an elderly man sat quietly, his cap resting on his knee. His jacket was old olive drab, the color long since faded, but it was clean. The patches on the sleeves were frayed, the stitching weary from decades of wear. His hands, gnarled but steady, were folded neatly over his lap. There was nothing remarkable about him at first glance, nothing that would have drawn attention in a sea of uniforms and ribbons. And yet, there was something in the way he sat upright, unbent by time, that suggested a man who had never quite learned how to slouch before authority. When the band struck the first notes of the national anthem, he rose slowly but with purpose. His back straightened, his chin lifted, and his right hand came up in a salute that was sharp, deliberate, and unflinchingly perfect. It was the kind of salute that came not from ceremony, but from instinct. The kind learned in jungles and deserts, in the years when such gestures were made to flagpoles draped in loss. A few people noticed. A handful of older veterans in the crowd gave subtle nods, recognizing something familiar in that posture. But one man saw something else entirely. Major General Raymond Holt stood near the podium, his uniform immaculate, his chest heavy with commendations that gleamed like a challenge to the Sunday. His gaze swept across the crowd in habitual appraisal until it landed on the old man. Holt's brow furrowed. He leaned slightly to the aide at his side. "Who authorized that seat?" "Sir?" the aide whispered, startled. "That man," Holt said, his jaw tightening. "Third row, Section B, civilian clothes. Shouldn't be there." The aide fumbled with his clipboard, flipping through the seating manifest. I don't have his name, sir. Could be retired personnel." "Could be," Holt snapped softly, eyes narrowing. "Or could be someone who wandered in off base. We're dedicating a memorial to Time's active, Time's service members. This isn't an open house." The anthem ended. The crowd resumed their seats, and the first speaker took the stage. Applause rolled like distant thunder across the field. But Holt's attention never left the old man. While others listened to words about honor, sacrifice, and service, Holt's focus was locked on the solitary figure who seemed out of place among the uniforms and dignitaries. The man didn't cheer, he didn't clap, he just watched. His pale eyes tracked the speakers, patient and still, as if he'd seen 100 ceremonies just like this one, and each of them had cost more than the crowd could ever imagine. Holt adjusted the crease of his sleeve, his jaw ticking with restrained annoyance. He couldn't explain it, but something about the man's calmness irked him. It wasn't disrespect, not exactly, it was indifference, the kind of quiet that didn't need approval, didn't seek acknowledgement. To a man like General Holt, that kind of composure was intolerable. The speeches went on, patriotic, polished, predictable, but beneath the pageantry, a quiet storm was forming. Each word about valor and leadership only made the general's irritation deepen, his pride pricked by the sight of one old stranger who seemed unimpressed by it all. When the final salute echoed, and the flag fell away from the memorial, the crowd rose in applause. General Holt clapped too, but his gaze never wavered. His mind had already moved past ceremony, past dignity. Somewhere beneath the thunder of applause and the blare of brass, a single, poisonous thought took root. Asterisk. Who does that old man think he is? Asterisk. The crowd began to thin as the speeches ended, and the band struck up a final triumphant march. The air shimmered with heat and brass, the kind of late afternoon light that flattened everything into gold and glare. Officers clustered in small groups near the new memorial, their laughter stiff and polite. Families posed for photos. The airmen on the field finally relaxed, the rigid lines of ceremony giving way to casual conversation. But at the edge of the reserved seating area, one scene refused to dissolve back into order. General Holt strode across the grass with a deliberate pace, his boots biting into the ground, his cap tucked neatly beneath one arm. His aide trailed a few paces behind, looking like a man trying to catch smoke. Holt's expression was carved in stone, his mouth tight, his jaw sharp, the kind of face that made subordinates stiffen at 20 yards. He stopped in front of the old man who was still seated, his eyes half-lidded against the sunday. "You," Holt said, the single word edged like a blade. The old man looked up slowly, calm, unhurried. "Sir?" Holt's shadow fell across him. "This section is for active duty personnel and official guests. You're neither. Who gave you permission to sit here?" The veteran blinked, the faintest hint of confusion or perhaps patience touching his features. "No one," he said softly. "I just came to pay my respects." Holt's eyes narrowed. "Just came to pay your respects?" He repeated the phrase as if it were a personal insult. "You think you can walk onto a military installation, sit among officers, and call it times paying respects asterisk? This isn't some public park, old man. This is a federal base." The nearby conversations began to falter. People could feel the charge in the air, the kind that precedes a lightning strike. The old man didn't rise to meet the tone. He only nodded slightly, his voice quiet but steady. "Didn't mean any harm, General. I've been here before, a long time ago. Thought I'd see it again." Holt let out a short, humorless laugh. "I'm sure you have. Probably on a tour bus." He took a step closer, close enough that the sun glinted off the medals across his chest. "I'll ask you once more. State your name and your authorization to be here, or I'll have security escort you off this base myself." The veteran looked up at him, meeting his glare without an ounce of fear. "Name's not important. I don't want trouble, just wanted to stand for the anthem." That calmness, unbothered, unbroken, was the spark that lit Holt's temper. His composure cracked. "Don't play games with me, old man." He reached out and seized the veteran's arm, yanking him to his feet with a force that drew a startled gasp from someone nearby. "You will answer when a general of the United States Army addresses you." The old man stumbled a step, but his balance returned with surprising steadiness. He looked down at Holt's hand gripping his sleeve. The fabric strained under the general's fingers. For a heartbeat, no one moved. "General, please," the aide murmured behind him, voice small and brittle. But Holt wasn't listening. His authority had been questioned in front of witnesses, and his pride demanded blood. "You think you can sit here like you belong. You don't belong here," he hissed. "These seats are for men who served this country with distinction." The veteran's gaze didn't waver. He reached up and gently freed his arm from the general's grip, his voice quiet as wind over stone. "I've stood at this field before, General, long before you ever did." It was said without defiance, without bitterness, just truth. That made it worse. Holt felt something twist inside him, something dark and ugly. The man's serenity wasn't submission, it was dismissal. The general's face reddened, his pulse roaring in his ears. His hand twitched upward, fingers curling into a fist, the gesture halfway between command and violence. Then came the voice. "General Holt." It wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. The tone alone froze everyone within earshot. It was the kind of voice that carried through combat radios and courtrooms alike, the voice of command earned, not bestowed. Holt turned, his expression caught somewhere between irritation and dread. Striding across the parade ground was a tall man in a tan service uniform, silver eagles gleaming at his collar, his cap tucked under his arm. The base's commanding officer, Colonel Daniel Reeves. Reeves's gaze moved from Holt to the old man and back again. "What's happening here?" he asked, his tone calm, but his eyes cut like glass. Holt straightened instinctively. "Sir, I was addressing an unauthorized civilian in the restricted seating area. He—" Reeves raised a hand, silencing him mid-sentence. Then he turned to the veteran. For the first time since the confrontation began, the old man smiled faintly, as if recognizing an old pattern in the young. Reeves' brow furrowed, his lips parted slightly in disbelief, his posture shifting from authority to something closer to reverence. The tension on the field thickened, a collective breath held in unison. Because whatever the general saw as an intruder, the CO had just recognized as something far greater. Colonel Reeves's voice cracked through the air with the sharp precision of a command that brooked no delay. "General Holt," he said, his tone as cold and clean as drawn steel. "Explain yourself." Every head within earshot turned. Conversations that had started up again after the ceremony now died mid-sentence. The color guard froze, their flags fluttering limply in the stilling wind. Even the band members, half-packed and ready to leave, stood motionless beside their instruments. Holt straightened his posture, the instinctive reflex of a man who had spent a lifetime being obeyed. "Sir," he began, his voice clipped but brimming with indignation. "I found this man seated among active duty personnel. He refused to identify himself. I was in the process of removing him when—" Reeves lifted one hand, halting the justification like he was swatting a fly. "That man?" he asked quietly, turning his gaze toward the old veteran. "You mean him?" The old man met the colonel's eyes with a quiet, polite nod. He looked neither angry nor afraid. There was only that same steady calm, the kind of calm that comes from having faced much worse men in much worse places. For a long, silent moment, Reeves just looked at him. His eyes narrowed, then widened slightly, as though seeing through the years. His breath caught, and a flicker of something passed over his face, confusion first, then disbelief, and finally a dawning, overwhelming recognition. He took a slow step forward, then another. "Sir," he said softly, almost a whisper. "It can't be." The crowd watched as Reeves came to a stop a few feet in front of the veteran. His shoulders squared, and in a single fluid motion, he brought his right hand up to his brow in a salute crisp, perfect, and utterly reverent. The air around them seemed to collapse into silence. Even the flag above the memorial stilled in the absence of wind. General Holt blinked, the scene in front of him making no sense. "Colonel, what in God's name are you doing? You're saluting a civilian." Reeves didn't look away. His voice, when he spoke, carried across the field, low but resonant, meant for every ear within reach. "That's no civilian, General." He lowered his salute slowly, his expression one of awe and gravity. Then he spoke the name. "Sergeant Major William Cross." The words dropped into the silence like thunder. Somewhere in the crowd, a veteran inhaled sharply, as if struck. Another whispered, "No way." The name rippled outward, carried by murmurs that grew into gasps of disbelief. Holt frowned. "Who?" Reeves turned to him sharply. "You don't know?" His tone was incredulous. "You don't know times him asterisk?" "I see an old man," Holt spat. "That's all I see." Reeves stepped closer, eyes blazing. "Then maybe that's the difference between the two of you, sir." He turned back to the veteran. "Permission to speak freely, Sergeant Major?" The old man, William Cross, nodded slightly, his lips curling into the faintest smile. "Always, son." Reeves faced the crowd now, his voice rising with conviction. This man was the backbone of the 7th Recon Group, a unit that didn't officially exist. He led missions no one else would volunteer for, missions that never made the record books. He brought his men home from places that erased entire battalions. There isn't a field operator alive who doesn't owe something to what he built. The murmuring spread wider, the younger airmen and soldiers looking at one another in confusion, while the older ones stood straighter, expressions shifting from disbelief to reverence. Reeves's words gained weight with every sentence. He's the man who refused every promotion beyond sergeant major because he said rank shouldn't keep him from the men who needed him most. The man who disappeared after the Darren Valley operation, presumed dead after saving 37 souls under enemy fire. He paused, turning to Holt. You were standing here, berating him, threatening to lay hands on him. A man who, by every measure that matters, outranks times every one of us on this field. Holt's mouth opened, but no words came out. The red of his face drained into gray. Reeves took a step back and saluted again, and this time, as if commanded by something older than protocol, the nearby soldiers followed suit. One by one, hats came off, hands rose, shoulders squared. The sound of boots, shifting into position, rolled through the crowd like a quiet wave. Even the youngest private could feel it, that invisible weight of legacy pressing down on them. William Cross stood there, motionless, his eyes glistening under the afternoon light. You don't need to do that, he said quietly. Reeves shook his head. With respect, Sergeant Major, we do. Because today isn't about rank, it's about remembering what real leadership looks like. And as the field of soldiers and officers held their salute, General Holt stood frozen among them, the only man with his hand still at his side, and the only one who finally began to understand just how small he looked in the shadow of a legend. General Holt stood motionless, the color bleeding from his face until it matched the pale gleam of his medals. The air around him felt heavier with every word that came from Colonel Reeves's mouth. The crowd remained utterly silent, as though the entire base itself were holding its breath. The afternoon sun, once bright and triumphant, now seemed cruel in its clarity, revealing every bead of sweat on the general's forehead, every twitch of shame in his jaw. Reeves's voice carried the calm authority of a man speaking both to his soldiers and to history itself. Sergeant Major William Cross, he said, looking to the crowd now, is the man whose missions you'll never read about in any field manual. When the rest of the world said impossible, he said times go anyway. Asterisk. He's the man who led 12 men into Black Canyon and brought 13 back out. The one who landed a crippled transport in a monsoon because his squad wouldn't survive another hour on the ground. He took a breath, the words tightening as emotion cracked through his composure. He was awarded the Silver Star 3 times, the Distinguished Service Cross twice, and turned them down every time because his men didn't all make it home. He said medals were for the living, and he'd already spent his share of miracles. A murmur rippled through the ranks, reverent and astonished. Every soldier, from the rawest private to the highest-ranking officer, could feel the gravity of the story pressing into their bones. Holt, however, stood still, a man trapped in the glare of his own disgrace. Reeves turned to him slowly. His voice softened, but the steel never left it. General Holt, you laid hands on a man who has carried this nation's burden longer than you've worn that uniform. You called him a trespasser on the very ground his courage helped defend. Holt's throat worked as he tried to find his voice. Colonel, Don't speak yet, Reeves interrupted. You've done enough of that today. He took one measured step closer, his shadow overlapping the general's boots. You will apologize, not behind closed doors, not in an office, here, before your troops, because leadership isn't about power, it's about accountability. The silence stretched taut, broken only by the whisper of the flag above them. Holt's eyes darted over the crowd, dozens of uniforms, rows of faces, hundreds of eyes fixed on him. Men who had once saluted him now watched with something colder than judgment, expectation. He swallowed, the sound audible in the stillness. His shoulders trembled, then straightened in reflexive defiance. For a moment, it seemed he might refuse. But the weight of it, of everything he'd just heard, crushed the last of his pride. His arm rose slowly, stiffly, until his hand came to his brow. The salute was rigid, imperfect, trembling at the edges. "Sergeant Major Cross," he said, voice breaking just enough to betray the man behind the rank. "I apologize. My actions were unworthy of this uniform and of the men who earned the right to wear it before me." William Cross looked at him for a long, quiet moment. Then he returned the salute, smooth and effortless, the muscle memory of a soldier who'd never forgotten what duty meant. His voice was soft, but it carried to every corner of the field. "Respect isn't worn on your chest, son," he said. "It's earned and remembered." The words hung in the air like a benediction. For several seconds, no one moved. Then a single pair of hands began to clap slow, deliberate. Another joined, then another. Within moments, the parade ground filled with the sound of applause, not raucous or cheering, but deep and resonant, a solemn tribute rather than celebration. Soldiers stood taller. Veterans in the crowd wiped their eyes. Even the wind seemed to pause, carrying the echo of that moment through the open sky. Holt's salute faltered. He lowered his arm and bowed his head. The medals on his chest caught the sunlight one last time before he turned and stepped back, diminished, humbled, stripped of the invisible armor that rank had once given him. William Cross didn't watch him go. He simply looked out at the memorial, at the names carved in stone, at the reflection of sky on polished granite, and let the silence settle once more. His hand brushed the edge of his worn jacket, fingertips grazing a faded patch almost invisible with age. When he finally turned to leave, every man and woman on that field stepped aside without a word, forming a quiet, instinctive path. They saluted as he passed. He acknowledged each with a nod, his gait slow but sure, his eyes steady on the horizon. And long after the last applause faded and the crowd dispersed, the story of that day, the day a general learned humility and a legend returned to life, would be told and retold in the mess halls, training grounds, and quiet corners of the service. Not as rumor, not as myth, but as the moment Fort Horizon remembered what honor truly looked like.